Welcome to this AbleNet University's webinar. The topic today is addressing problem behaviors. How do we come up with preventive strategies, personalized supports, and positive strokes for children to be successful in the educational setting? And the webinar is designed to address the ideal and effective type of paraeducator supports that can be provided, that can be delivered in order to advance the learning outcomes for the student. My name is Padmaja Sarathy, and I will share a little bit of information about me in the next slide. What are we going to be talking about today? The focus of this session is how do we respond to problem behaviors, and how do we come up with proactive, student-specific, personalized solutions adhering to the PBIS principle, the Positive Behavior Intervention Support Principles. And the way I have labeled them, it's called the 3 P's approach. P1 is preventive strategies. P2 is the personalized supports. And P3, which goes along with the prevention and personalization, how do we deliver positive strokes? Unfortunately, most of the time, students who exhibit behavioral issues don't always receive the right kind of encouraging feedback and positive strokes. I do want to mention right at the outset, this is an introductory session, and also all of the material that's presented in this webinar session is taken from the Paraeducator Training Manual. It's a multiple unit training program. It's a DVD, as well as there is a trainee manual for paraeducators to use. And I am the author of this publication, the DVD, the training unit, and the company that publishes it is Legal Digest, and so they want me to make sure that people don't kind of print this out and distribute it. This is for your personal use only. And before I go on, I would about myself, I would like to find out who are the people who are participating in today's webinar. Are you a paraeducator? Are you a special education teacher? Are you a district administrator that is getting kind of together the materials for PDE session for your paraeducators? Or am I missing out anyone? Who are the other participants today? Please do go ahead and indicate whether you are a paraeducator, special education teacher, administrator, or other personnel. The poll should be working. For some reason, why the poll is not working, maybe it's still working on getting the response. I see in the chat box a lot of people saying they are speech pathology assistant, special ed teacher, a lot of speech pathologists. That's wonderful. And special ed teachers, there is somebody from Lafourche Parish where I do some work, and there are some counselors. I don't know why the anyway, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, it looks like the poll is not working. Maybe we will come back to it and check if it has come. As I mentioned, I am an author and I'm also an educational consultant. And the Paraeducator training DVD and the training manual picture that you see, it's a trainer of trainer DVD with multiple training units. And the material for this session, as well as the previous 2 sessions that I presented, were taken from this manual. And I have also many other books and products that I have developed, and they are published through several companies. Let me go back and check if the poll has come back. No, for some reason the poll is not showing. Let's move on. As I mentioned, today's topic is the 3 P's approach. How do we respond to problem behaviors? During the first webinar in this series, we focused on how do we deliver that support from the paraeducator so that it is not hindering, but instead assisting the student to advance his or her learning outcomes. So how do we make sure that support is discrete and optimal? Because one of the things that has emerged from research is that the presence of the paraeducator almost within 3 feet of the student can actually have negative outcomes for the student. So how do we deliver that support that is really effective but at the same time non-intrusive? In the second webinar in this series, I focused on how do we make sure that that collaboration between the teacher and the student is consistent, constant, and ongoing, so that ultimately our desire is to advance the student outcome. So all of that planning, all of that collaboration should be targeting that. So today, I am taking on the topic of the behavior issues, because frequently paraeducators play a very important role in reducing and eliminating the problem behavior, as well as in monitoring the student, gathering information, and gathering the data to share with the teachers so that an adequate and an effective intervention plan could be prepared. So one of the most critical things is the preventive strategy. In coming up with a preventive strategy, we have to make sure how the adult's response is to the problem behavior. Frequently, the adult response to the problem behavior can in itself actually, instead of eliminating the behavior, may actually increase the occurrence of that behavior. And it is not only enough to address that problem behavior in terms of prevention, but we also need to teach the student new skills so that the student does not repeat that behavior. And when the student is actually demonstrating appropriate behavior, we need to catch them being good. We need to come up with the positive strokes. And one of the critical roles that a paraeducator can play before the problem behavior becomes too intense or the student is too agitated and we cannot do anything at that time because the problem behavior has escalated to such an extent, is how can we watch for those precursor behaviors, that fidgetiness, that restlessness, and so that we can prevent that escalation. And coming back to what I mentioned earlier on, the positive behavior intervention and support, PBIS. One of the first things is how do we diffuse that behavior so that it doesn't escalate? How do we make sure we have some protective factors which are like environmental supports? that the environmental changes that could actually be the factors behind triggering that behavior. And one of the other things that frequently happens that may be triggering some of the problem behaviors is because many of these children may have academic skill deficits. And they don't know how to communicate saying, I don't know how to do this multiplication problem. They instead get angry at the person who is presenting the task to them, or they get angry at the task itself because they don't necessarily always know how to seek help. So we have to see if there is a skill deficit that is contributing to the problem behavior. And the beautiful thing about PBIS, it is not a punishment-based approach, but it is focused on how do we achieve longer-term outcomes for the student so that the student is academically benefiting and there is a reduction in the behavior, and so that he also or she also knows how to learn new skills to replace that inappropriate behavior. Most of you may be familiar with the ABC behavior chain. So it is important for paraeducators to be trained in it too. They have to know what triggers the behavior, when does the behavior occur, where, what context does the behavior occur, and why? Why does the problem behavior occur? What is contributing to that? Based on the principles of ABC chain. The A stands for the antecedents, and it is something that occurs before an undesirable, inappropriate behavior. Let's say the student is presented with a difficult task, or at least she perceives it as being difficult, or it may really be difficult for her. So that is the antecedent, and that triggers the behavior, the problem behavior. It is important that we are able to define. We have to guide the paraeducator who may be observing the behavior to clearly define that behavior in terms of measurable terms and observable terms. Frequently, we may hear words like, oh, he's non-compliant, oh, she has an attitude, but that does not define the behavior. We have to say clearly, the student, when given the multiplication task, he rolled up the paper and threw it down on the floor, or threw it under his desk, or hid it in his desk. So the next C stands for the consequence, and that's the response to the behavior, the adult response usually, and it's something that immediately follows the behavior. Let's say the student throws that paper, the worksheet, under the desk, or he engages in some other inappropriate behavior. Immediately, let's say the student is sent to timeout. That is the consequence. In this particular case, by being sent to timeout, he or she is actually escaping working on that task. So it is important for us to realize clearly, and it's important for the paraeducator to be trained in the ABC model. So let's look at some preventive strategy, because prevention is the primary and the best intervention to avoid problem behaviors. One of the things that concerns me a lot when I go visit programs is we all have a good understanding of what prevention is. We know about preventive strategies, but somehow there is a gap between that understanding and the implementation. We tend to react kind of immediately with a consequence that actually increases the likelihood of that behavior. Either we give too much attention, or we allow the student to escape from that task, or we give a negative feedback so that there is nothing positive happening to the child, and the student just learns to ignore. So let's look at some simple, effective preventive strategies. First of all, the physical environment of the classroom. It should be calm, comfortable, and it should not be noisy. It should not be overstimulating. One of the simplest things to do is there are many, many classrooms that have accumulated a lot of clutter maybe over the years, and if the cabinets are all visible and they are kind of overflowing with materials, the simplest thing to do is to cover them with a white sheet or even with newsprint so that that is not distracting. And the other simple thing to do is to make sure that student, especially in an inclusive setting, if the student is participating in an inclusive setting, is that the student is not placed close to stimulating windows or placed to near a kind of a noisy situation, or she is not next to a door that keeps opening and closing. So that is another thing that's very, very important. And any kind of sensory overload may lead to stress, especially for children with autism spectrum disorders and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They do get easily distracted. That's one thing. The other thing is these sensory stimulation will increase, overload will increase when there is a lot of environmental noise or distractors. And as I mentioned, it's important to arrange the seating in such a way that they are not close to open doors or open cabinets, or and there is not too much material distracting them. And the other thing is, it is important for these students, especially in an inclusive setting or in even in a self-contained setting, to make sure that the peer next to them is a competent peer, is not one who is easily distracted, and so that they can serve as a model. And another thing that will be helpful is to have classroom rules. I know this is kind of more at the elementary level. This can be modified and adapted to a middle school or a high school level, is to pair the rules with a picture, so because pictures do speak 1,000 words, and the visuals are extremely important for students with autism spectrum disorders and with ADHD, and with a lot of them, because it immediately communicates what you want your student to do. So that's one of the things. The other thing, of course, is structure. We have to make sure there is a routine, there is a predictability, and there is a structure that's continuously followed for students to benefit from instruction. And particularly students with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, they do thrive on predictable routines. So, and they do like sameness. So we cannot suddenly have one day a week, or we are going to have fun Fridays, or you know what, we are going to take a break this afternoon because it's a brain break. No, we have to make sure we follow the same schedule and the same routine, so that sudden changes in the routine can cause problem behaviors. And it is also important, if there is a sudden change, let's say in the schedule, because they have an assembly that they have to go to, it is important that we provide advance warning and we guide our students to be able to look at their schedule, and they themselves help to see that there is going to be a change and a new picture. If they are using a picture schedule, I hope students with autism, however verbal they may be, are helped with a picture activity schedule so that they themselves are involved in making that change, so that they are alert and aware of the impending change to their schedule for that day. That will also help prevent problem behaviors. One of the other important things we need to do, especially adults who are working with students who may or may not, in any situation where they may likely to exhibit problem behavior, is to avoid reactive responses. Let's look at this example. This is something that I did observe in a classroom. Andrew starts kind of rolling on the floor during a group activity. This was circle time. And the paraeducator supporting him reacted in a kind of a common way that I do see in a lot of the classrooms. She tells Andrew to stop that immediately. Stop it, Andrew. And she warns him that he will be taken to the office if he doesn't stop rolling on the floor. Or sometimes they do respond saying, you know what, you're going to get time out. And what we teach is, okay, the child doesn't want to sit on the circle time, and he is rolling because he is getting a little distracted. Then we send him or her to timeout, and actually he goes to timeout, and he is escaping from paying attention. He's escaping from that group circle time. He is escaping from being required to sit on the mat. So we have to make sure that our responses are thoughtful responses to solve the problem rather than a reactive response. And so now I can imagine you asking me, what do you do if a child is rolling on the floor during circle time? Maybe we can show a picture of the child, the photo of the child, sitting very nicely on the mat, and remind the child, see this? And you don't have to even use any words so that it doesn't distract the other children. We can just show a picture of that child sitting nicely on the mat. And sometimes you may have to do it several times, but that simple reminder of what is expected will get that child to sit up at least for a few minutes, and we may have to do that. And when the child is sitting nicely, oh, I like the way you were sitting, a positive stroke to come immediately. Or the child maybe earns a kind of a penny or a token for every 5 minutes that he's sitting nicely. So that's what I call cueing them to the rules. So in other words, you prepare these cards with appropriate behaviors, and you laminate those cards. You can just use half an index card, and you put that picture on that, and you hole punch it and put them on a ring. And you cue them to the rules at different settings. Maybe you're walking down the hallway, you are in another place in the cafeteria for lunch. So use the pictured rule cue cards. In other words, these rule cards cue the children. These are visual cues, and they remind the students of the rules or what they should be doing in that particular situation. I do say here the next slide shows a picture, and it is not the next slide, it's kind of several slides down, but I have explained it what pictured rule cue cards are, so you can kind of visualize that. The student can be gradually trained. After the adult begins to use these cue cards, then you give one set to the student, and you point and gesture to the rule cue cards, and the child starts using the cue cards. Okay, one of the major challenges, many children, particularly with autism or ADHD, or sometimes even students who may have cognitive difficulty, experience is with transition. Transition when it involves people, transition particularly when it involves a change of activity, or a transition that involves even more so in the case of a context or a setting. So if the environment has changed, they have to go to the cafeteria, or they are in the playground and they have to come back to the classroom, or when they are in the gym and they have to come back to the classroom, or they have to go to the gym. So it is extremely important in these situations to use visual cue. It's an effective strategy, and it is better to provide advance warning of the change that's going to come in terms of the environment or in terms of the activity. And it will increase the compliance with the transition that the demands of the transition poses. In addition, you may want to use verbal cue, but visuals work very effectively. And let us say you want the child to kind of move from one activity to another within the classroom setting, then you can even set up a timer. For example, the child is working on a preferred activity, and you want the child to move to a somewhat of a less preferred activity. It is important to use a timer. You can even use an hourglass timer so that it doesn't attract any attention and does not distract other students. But it is important that the child is warned a few minutes before the end of the activity. Then the stop comes when the activity is actually ending. Or you can also use a kind of a musical instrument that can be used with several students together as a transition signal. And the other important thing is it is important to have kind of a close supervision and monitoring. That is where I believe the paraeducators play a very, very important role, because in many classrooms they are there to assist students to make the transition or to be able to work on the academic tasks that they have been assigned. So that close supervision can be provided by the paraeducator, noting down any triggering behaviors, how is the student responding to different types of setting, what is happening during recess or on the way to the gym or on the way to an assembly, school assembly. So it is important that the paraeducators help provide that kind of data in terms of close supervision and monitoring so that we can come up with the appropriate intervention. So I would suggest that the teacher and the paraeducator partner together to strategically monitor and supervise situations, like provide zone monitoring and scan and move frequently so that the paraeducator is not just sitting behind or sitting next to or sitting within 3 feet of the student. As a matter of fact, I was in a classroom a couple of weeks ago. What kind of bothered me was there was this student who does have a tendency to wander within the classroom, doesn't go outside, but within the classroom, and he does have some significant cognitive difficulties too. What they did was they kind of put him in a kind of a situation where the table was kind of blocking him, and there were 2 paraeducators kind of sitting on either side so that he would not leave that area. But that is not what I mean by close supervision and monitoring, because what needs to happen is those paraeducators should not be sitting so close to the student. He is getting all the attention, and he acts up even more to get even more attention because now he has an audience. So it is important that the paraeducators kind of circulate around the room if it's an inclusive setting, or in a small self-contained setting, small room, they have to be moving around or keep themselves busy, but at the same time keep an eye on the student. And they have to make sure there is a kind of a purposeful interaction between the adult and the student and between the paraeducator and the teacher. And the other thing that helps in a preventive strategy is many of these students will benefit from a kind of a relaxation corner. You might have heard me say this when I presented the session on students with autism spectrum disorder. I call it the safe space. These safe spaces help to reduce the anxiety, especially if the student is feeling agitated or restless. Maybe he can take his safe space card or a break card and take a 5-minute break to relax and to calm down. And I think this is not timeout, so this is not a punishment area, but this is a relaxation, safe space in order for the student to calm down. And moving on from preventive strategies to what kind of personalized supports can we provide to meet kind of the specific needs of a specific student. How do we personalize that support to reduce the problem behavior? This is what I call the P2. I'll give you an example. Robert, he is a first grader. He's high functioning, and he has difficulty engaging in any activity that he thinks is not his preferred activity. He would rather be always sitting in front of the computer and working on the computer. And he perceives all of the other activities, even though he has the capability to do it, he perceives them as demanding. So whenever he is asked to move to a teacher-directed activity, it kind of triggers tantrums. And then kind of response to the tantrum ends up in a major meltdown. So he kind of screams, drops to the floor, starts kicking, and it lasts about 5-10 minutes and kind of disrupts the classroom instruction. So what can we do? One of the things that would help him is he has a first-then approach that's used with him. He has to do his math work or whatever work that the teacher requires first, and then he gets to do the computer. In the beginning, because we have to build the student's tolerance for the non-preferred activity, we have to make sure that we don't demand 20 minutes of work from the student, from Robert. In the beginning, it may even be as little as 5 minutes, and then we gradually increase it to 7 and 10 and go on. And then initially, they may be equally matched, 5 minutes of work that the teacher requires, and then maybe 5 minutes of preferred. And it is important that we use a timer that goes with that, and we can gradually train. As a matter of fact, in the case of Robert, because he's high functioning, he can even set up the timer. And gradually then we can increase the time, the preferred, non-preferred activity, like it may become the preferred after gradually he's trained to focus more time on it, and the preferred activity like the computer, the time on that is gradually reduced, so that, and at the same time we also make sure that because Robert is high functioning, it is also paired with some kind of a token system, so that for every 5 minutes or every 7 minutes that he is working, he earns a certain amount of reward, and then later on he can exchange it maybe at the end of the morning or at the end of the afternoon for some kind of a reward that he finds enjoyable. And the other thing, of course, is Robert would benefit from visual supports. It is important, even though Robert is high functioning, there is a picture schedule that is used, and that says reading time or math time with built-in breaks. And then in addition to that, he may need for that activity that he's working on, like a card that says, go, you can begin this, almost done, like a few minutes before, and a stop picture, word cards paired with pictures to assist Robert. And gradually he can learn to self-monitor himself. And this is a picture of a visual schedule. And all students, particularly I am talking about students with autism spectrum disorder, even if they are high functioning, it is important for them to have a kind of an activity schedule. This is like a folder, and for a student who is the upper elementary, middle school, and high school, the folder can be inserted inside a binder so that it is with them all the time. Wherever they go, they have their schedule with them. And these words, the text is paired with the visuals. And they get to move the picture and the text as the activity is finished, from the activities to do to the activities done or the activities finished. Some of the other personalized support is to kind of ignore some of the minor whining for getting the work done. And as soon as he shows an inclination towards getting started with the work, making an encouraging positive feedback, not the typical, oh, good job, but, oh, I like the way you're sitting. Oh, you're starting your work. Good. So you work for 5 minutes. So there's kind of an encouraging feedback, or even showing a happy face to him, because he's just a first grader. So, they can even show a happy face or a token reward. And so it is helpful to use kind of limited amount of verbal reminders and verbal directions, and use as much as possible visuals. And certainly, we have to make sure we refrain from using the timeout, because Robert is only going to take advantage of it and escape work. So, and also it is important not to threaten the student with consequences that we cannot really carry out. Because if we say, oh, you're going to spend your time in timeout today if you just behave like this, that is not a response that we want. Or say, no computer for you, or no recess for you. These are not threats that we can carry out. So it is important for that adult, for that paraeducator, to be trained in making sure that the response, the words that we used, is kind of something that we can truly carry out and will benefit the student. Okay, some pictures of the visual cue card that I was talking about earlier on. Let's say Alex. Alex, it's kind of a minor behavior, but it is quite disruptive. What he does is he likes to tap on his desk with his pencil. And he knows that it attracts attention, so he continues with this annoying sound whenever he's sitting at his desk. And so the teacher wants him, the paraeducator comes next to him and says, stop it, don't do that, but it doesn't help. So what we use instead is a picture cue card. You can see that picture, no noise, and the pencil, no tapping. I couldn't get a picture that shows tapping, so I wanted the picture kind of flat on the desk. And you can add a picture of the desk and no noise, the text and the thing, if you can get actually a photo of that. And the paraeducator uses the pictured rule cue cards depicting this no noise to encourage Alex to work quietly and to remind Alex. And that's all that is done. And then the paraeducators comes up with additional replacement behavior after a discussion with the teacher. And that is, whenever he feels like tapping, maybe he can clasp his hands together, or if he feels kind of restless, he can use a koosh ball and squeeze on the koosh ball, because it may provide him that sensory stimulation that he's seeking maybe with that pencil. And always it is a question of trial and error. Maybe there is one particular strategy, particular technique that will work with a specific student. That's why we call it the personalized support. And the other thing is preparing student in advance. For example, in the case of Cedric, another student, this could be another girl too. I seem to have too many boy names there. And Cedric has difficulty whenever he has to move into a large area like that he finds to be overstimulating, like the gym or in the lunchroom, or if they have to go to an assembly. It is important for him to be reminded before he goes into that setting with a kind of a schedule that will show where he will be going, and along with the pictured rule cue cards. And let's say he has to sit for some time after he finishes his lunch. It is important for Cedric to have something to do. So it is important that the paraeducators who may be taking these students to the lunchroom take something additional materials for someone like Cedric, and gradually Cedric can be trained to also take the materials himself to use that time after lunch to work on it so that he doesn't become fidgety and restless. It is important for these students to have some kind of fidgety toys like Tangle toy or Koosh balls, something that they can squeeze to get rid of some of that agitation, restlessness, and stress. And if you should run into a stressful crisis situation, maybe during a fire drill or maybe a tornado drill, and the student starts making a lot of noise or starts whining, it is important if after, of course you can't do it while you're having the fire drill or the tornado drill, that they have opportunity to relax. When they come back inside and they're still agitated, to go to a safe space and calm down. Thing. Also, if for some other reason they should have a situation where they're getting very upset or meltdown, it is important for them to have kind of learn some breathing techniques and calming down during after the crisis. Of course, it's not possible to do it during the crisis, but during the crisis you have to make sure you have some additional support available, and the paraeducator has arranged with someone else to help when they are making that transition. And moving on to the last one, which is P3, which is the positive strokes. It is important for us to encourage students when they are behaving appropriately, even if it is exhibited for less than a second, because praise is a powerful and it has a powerful positive impact. And we have to constantly be practicing things like, oh, I like the way you are listening to the story. I like the way you're sitting on your mat. Oh, Robert, I like the way you're working on your math work. You seem to be focusing a lot of attention. And Conroy recommends that we use 4 to 5 positive statements to every corrective statement. I think that's a good principle to follow. The other thing that helps a lot is also giving choices. Okay, for example, something, do you want to do the first 5 problems and the last 5 problems? If the student has difficulty completing, let's say, 20 problems, you give a choice of 10, but they get to make the choice of first 5 or last 5. They can also get to choose the kind of a reinforcer that they would like. What they have found that these things not only decrease the disruptive behavior when you give choices, but it actually increases the accuracy of the attempted problems. And for a really long-term outcome for all students, they have to learn to self-monitor themselves. Self-management is really, truly the longer-term outcome for students. So we have to teach self-talk strategies for students to learn to calm down. One of the techniques is the total technique, and you will find it in the website that's listed in it's called the CSEFEL, www.CSEFEL. It gives the pictures of the total technique, how a young child learns to problem solve when he or she is faced with a problem solution and tries to find the solution himself or herself. And we can teach breathing techniques. And one of the things that helps is using music, especially during transitions. You might have heard me say in one of the previous webinars is that magical musical transition is a music CD that a music therapist and I have put together, helps a lot for the student to calm down and to use during transitions. And I have a list of resources listed here, and the website that I just mentioned where you can find the total technique The cscfelvanderbilt.edu is also listed here. And some of the other resources that I mentioned, and also the Paraeducator Power Training Guide, the training manual, the DVD, is also listed there. And while this particular Paraeducator series is over, I will be presenting next year, focusing a Paraeducator session on how do we provide adequate, effective, and optimal support to help advance self-dependence of students with severe and multiple disabilities. And then sometime in April, I'm doing a session for paraeducators who provide support in the early childhood setting. And thank you very much for participating in this AbleNet University webinar. And I want to thank again AbleNet University for hosting the webinar. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining the session. Thank you and have a wonderful day.